I served, as you mentioned, in Boris Johnson's cabinet. I really like Boris Johnson, actually. He was a man of many qualities, and
man
with
of
things
integrity,
like
man
the
of
rollout
honesty, man of decency.
Well, I was going to say, the greatest hits I was going to list were actually going to be rolling out the vaccine before any other major country, unblocking the whole Brexit thing. I thought actually his stance in Ukraine, which was world leading. I think those are the sort of things I would pick out. I don't think, whether you're in the Conservative Party or elsewhere, that anyone misses the drama of those days. The world has moved on, and Rishi Sunak is pursuing the priorities of things like reducing the waiting lists and growing the economy.
Where do you stand in this Conservative civil war?
Well, look, first of all, if an MP wants to resign, or even three in this case, that's their business, right? They are elected to represent their constituencies. Boris has seen the content of a report from the Privileges Committee that none of the rest of us have seen, and this is the decision that he has reached. And I think that is really what this is about. Meanwhile, actually, Number 10 has been under new management with Rishi Sunak. The five, as you mentioned, people's priorities, in particular things like halving inflation, growing the economy, stopping the small boats, are things that we're just relentlessly focused on, and that's where our focus will
But at the very least, it's self-indulgent, isn't it? I mean, it's going to cost the taxpayer money, it's going to cost council taxpayers money to have these unnecessary by-elections.
Well, as I say, it's up to MPs. I take the view of elected for five.
Money on an unnecessary by-election.
Well, democracy, I'm afraid, does sometimes cost money, and if what you're asking is, do I generally think it's better for MPs to serve 5 years? Yes, I do, and stand down. But I also just want to say, to put it on the record, I served, as you mentioned, in Boris Johnson's cabinet. I really like Boris Johnson, actually. He was a man of many qualities, and with things like the rollout,
man of decency.
Well, I was going to say, the greatest hits I was going to list were actually going to be rolling out the vaccine before any other major country, unblocking the whole Brexit thing. I thought actually his stance in Ukraine, which was world leading. I think those are the sort of things I would pick out. I don't think, whether you're in the Conservative Party or elsewhere, that anyone misses the drama of those days. The world has moved on, and Rishi Sunak is pursuing the priorities of things like reducing the waiting lists and growing the economy. I think are really the things that people are worried about.
But where do you stand on this charge which Boris Johnson made in his resignation statement, which I have to say I am hearing from other Conservatives, that this government is no longer a proper Conservative government? It's got record high levels of taxation, it's failed on the pledges which it made, actually that seems to be saying, the sooner we get rid of Rishi Sunak, the better from the Conservatives' perspective.
Well, first of all, on the pledges, we're growing the economy, even though actually economists were saying we would be in recession right now. And by the way, Germany's just gone into recession, the Eurozone is in recession, and the UK is having its growth upgraded. We're stopping the small boats. We've seen a 20% reduction this year. So these are things that we are starting to deliver, and I think that's a very, very conservative platform. You're right about taxes. None of us want to see taxes this high. They're this high because we spent, was it £400 billion on COVID? Probably another 100 billion of costs from the Ukraine war. There've been a lot of costs, and of course those have to be paid for, not just by extending debt forever. So of course there've been a lot of costs, but one of our pledges is to reduce debt over the medium term, and we want to see lower taxes as well, all of which you get with a Conservative government, and you will not get if Keir Starmer's Labour Party come in, who always leave unemployment higher in every single occasion that they've been elected to run this country. So the one thing we've also got is very low unemployment, and that is a fundamentally Conservative thing.
Will you get those tax cuts before the next election? Because that is something that people far wider than the Boris Johnson camp are really pushing Rishi Sunak for, as proof that the Conservatives are still Conservative, and to give Conservative voters a reason to back your party in a year or so's time.
Well, first of all, the most obvious thing to point out is when you have very high inflation driven by those high energy costs, and then banks around the world putting up interest rates. When you have high inflation, it is getting inflation down is like a tax cut in itself. We've seen it come down to 8.7% so far. We want to see that fall further, and we're making progress, but there's much further to go. When it comes to tax and that whole subject, Rishi Sunak said in his own leadership election that he wants to cut taxes. He set out plans for that. we've got to make sure that in doing so, we don't end up pushing up interest rates higher than they would otherwise be. By the way, that's exactly the Labour plan that I heard you say you're going to talk to a Labour shadow about later. They want to raise another £28 billion, which would be another £1,000 on everyone's bills. We don't want to go that route.
Yeah, we'll obviously enjoy talking to Labour when we get to them. But saying you want to cut taxes is very different to getting on to doing them. I mean, I'd like to run a marathon in 2 hours, but it ain't going to happen. So what's the actual timetable for this?
Well, Rishi actually set out a timetable for this when he was running for the leadership, and as you'd expect me to say, I can't write future budgets here on your programme today, much as I'd like to, but the intention is, as we've done, to stabilise the economy, get growth in after the Ukraine war, which we're doing, and we've got growth that wasn't expected this year, it's now coming in, cut inflation, and then make sure that we're looking after the medium-term debt and reducing the tax burden on people as the second part of that. And that is exactly the plan that we're following. It's working so far. I'm afraid you will have to wait for the budgets to see specific tax numbers.
But you have confidence that this is a promise that Rishi Sunak isn't going to ditch, because he has ditched other promises. You know, the Minister for the North, which is admittedly a much smaller pledge. On lots of other issues, the Prime Minister in his first of 2 leadership contests did promise an awful lot, which he's either turned back on or is just not going to deliver.
Well, just on the Minister for North thing, the Prime Minister is the Minister for the North. He represents a northern constituency, unlike the sort of Labour lawyer Sir Keir Starmer's Islington pad. It's true. It is true that Rishi represents a constituency in Yorkshire, and he has assigned himself with that role, Minister for the North. So I reject the idea that he's not properly representing the North, much more so than Labour London. I have to point out. But look, also he is working through what is, given the war in Ukraine, a pretty sensitive global situation, but really pushing ahead with things like his agreement with the US President this week on those agreements to help improve on the $1 trillion worth of investments, £1 trillion actually in our case, of investment that we have in the US and vice versa to create more jobs in the UK. I think he's really getting on with the job.
Okay, well, let's just focus on that. You talk about the £1 trillion of investment, and of course it's the IRA Act, which America is investing largely in green industries. That's your area of responsibility. Truth is, you're going backwards on that, aren't you? That you haven't hit the targets on rolling out car charging points. You're rolling back on your support for hydrogen and the levy on bills, and you don't really have any idea of how to move to a green energy production, whereas you've already said Labour want to put up bills. That's as maybe. They say they're going to do it by funding, but at least they do have a green renewal plan for this country, which your government lacks.
If you'll give me 20 seconds, maybe I can correct that record. We have more renewables coming on stream, particularly things like offshore wind, than virtually any other country in the world. We have the world's largest offshore wind farm, the second largest, the third largest. We're just building the fourth largest. We have. Hold on a minute. Onshore wind, by the way, is our greatest single renewable. That's about 14 gigawatts of onshore wind. That's the largest single chunk. When it comes to solar power, it will surprise your viewers and listeners to hear that we have as much solar power as France, despite being geographically half the size and having a usually less sunny climate, today aside. So, actually we're doing incredibly well on this. Incredibly well. People underestimate. I'm sorry, by the way, now you've got me on my chosen subject. No other advanced economy in the world has cut emissions by the level that we have. None of them. They're all racing to catch up, and on the IRA, as I like to call the IRA Act for obvious reasons, on the IRA Act in the US, what they're doing is racing to try to catch up with us. We've had £100 billion of investment in our renewables over the last 10 years. Their programme, which I know is slated at being $300 or $400 billion, is actually catch-up time for them.
Well,
and then lastly, the point I'd make...
Actually, but anyway.
Well, I mean, you can measure it in different ways depending on how many people come
right,
forward.
now,
But it's actually listed as $379 billion.
Okay,
But we won't go into that one too far.
I know that you didn't go into hydrogen or electric cars, but anyway.
Well, no, just briefly on hydrogen and it's connected with something called carbon capture, utilisation and storage. We've just announced a £20 billion programme, which I challenge you to find any country in the world who are matching, on carbon capture, utilisation and storage, which includes the hydrogen economy. So I would argue on every one of these grounds. By the way, I think we're doing the classic British thing. Let me just finish this point. I think we're doing the classic British thing of imagining we're somehow behind. When I travel around the world and I see and I talk to colleagues from the G7, all these other countries, they are envious of our record, which, by the way, 10 years ago in our electricity system used 40% coal to create our electricity. You know what the number will be this year?
Go on.
Zero. We will not use any coal in our electricity system. We're doing an incredible job on this stuff, and it's about time we recognised it.
Electric cars are a bit of a mess, though, aren't they? We've got Rowan Atkinson, who recently wrote that he felt he'd been duped by the switch to an electric car. I've had an electric car since 2017. I don't think the charging network's got any better. I've just got a glove box full of different logins and cards for chargers that are often out of service. Do you accept that it's a system that doesn't work unless you're some kind of weird electric car enthusiast? Which you might be.
No, I don't agree. I think I am. I've also had an electric car for a number of years. But I agree in part. I agree with you that it's no good having lots of different membership cards and apps and whatever for every different electric car charger, which is why actually as Transport Secretary I legislated, and my successor's taking it through, to make sure they're all contactless, so you can use your phone on those which are bigger than 7 or 8 kilowatts of the faster chargers. You can just come up, tap the phone, and that hassle is taken away. But in this conversation, by the way, I hear a lot of nonsense talked as well. Most people don't live in a petrol station, which is the current situation. If you have a petrol car, you need to go to a petrol station. However, 70% of homes in this country have off-street parking, and those people, by and large, charge their vehicles at home. I don't know if that's what you're doing, and often, very rarely, if ever, need to use chargers elsewhere. What the government's focused on are the billions of pounds to make sure there is charging available for people who don't have off-street parking, and that's where the focus is. There are over 40,000 of those, which is why you get very London-centric conversations on all of this. And actually, when you go out,
London,
there are, but it's not a reflective picture.
Anyway, I just want to get back to...
No, look, I love London, but there are 10 million people in London and 70 million people in the country, and I'm just making the point that not the whole experience is one of London. And you're right, we do need those electric chargers for London, but there are 40,000 public chargers already. There are probably 300,000 or 400,000 people who have chargers installed at home. So we're actually doing very well on this. We are in the leading pack in terms of people making that switch of any country in the world. And yet again, from this interview, you might imagine the opposite's the case.
I just want to ask you two final questions. One is, what should the Privileges Committee in the House of Commons do now about Boris Johnson? Should they debate and enforce a sort of suspended sentence on him?
Well, I don't know the specific rules and regulations for the Privileged Committee where somebody stood down. That would be for them. I do think it's important to have parliamentary processes, and that exists. I hear what Boris has said, and he's very upset about the process. But he's at the advantage of having seen what they've actually said. I don't know what they'll say or do next. It is, of course, a committee which is about MPs, sitting MPs, so presumably he's removed himself so that their reach doesn't come to him.
Final questions come in the course of this interview from a listener. One question for Grant Shapps: is he ever embarrassed?
I'm human like the rest of us, right? But I suspect that question came in from somebody who is not typically a Conservative supporter, may I suggest.
Grant Shapps, thanks very much. After past, Labour's Pat McFadden gives us the opposition view.